Advanced scripting, creating private utility functions and preference variables. In this nugget, we're going to use a particular technique to accomplish a couple of different things. First of all, I'm going to show you how to add functions to a module that are private to that module, meaning they're only visible from within that module and can only be used by other functions in that module. And using that same technique, I'll show you how to create a module level variable, something I often use as a preference variable, and I'll show you what that means. So it's a variable that can be loaded and unloaded into and out of the shell, visible to anyone using the module, or a way to keep an internal module level variable private so that no one can mess with it. For me, the need to build a private utility function into a module often comes kind of as an organic process. So here in this module, and this is a module that we were working with in some of the previous nuggets, I've got two functions, a get disk space info and a get computer state. Now, or set computer state. And in set computer state, one of the things I've done here is I've created this kind of little see if the computer is responding first. So I've used the test connection command, and that just does a quick ping. It actually uses WMI on my local computer to do a ping, but when I use this minus quiet switch the way I've done, it's going to return true or false. So if the computer can't be pinged, then it's going to skip over all this. Now my logic here isn't perfect, and that's another reason I'll sometimes get to where I'm about to go. Now, just because a ping works does not necessarily mean I'm going to be able to get through via WMI. So I kind of set a variable assuming I'm going to be able to, and then I actually try to make a WMI connection. And if I can't, if this errors out, then I set a variable to false. And then down here, I really only do the main body of my code if that was still true. So my logic isn't perfect. A lot of times to kind of walk my way through all the different scenarios about how things could fail or whatever else, kind of you have to play with it a little bit. For example, right here, if this is false, in other words, if the ping doesn't work, I'm going to drop down to here. Works hasn't already been defined. So you see, I can kind of get myself into a bad place. But let's say I go through the process of sorting that out, and I make this all work, and I rearrange the logic so that it works the way it should. And then I come back up here and decide, you know, on this function, I'd kind of like to do the same thing. It's unfortunately not as easy as just copying and pasting the code, though, because to fix this, the bit of my function I care about is going to have to be integrated into this logic. So first of all, I don't really like the idea of copying and pasting code around. I'd like to do everything in one spot so that I only have to fix the logic one time. Right? If I start copying and pasting this into another function or 10 more functions, and then I realize I've got the logic wrong, I have to go fix it in 10 different places. I'd kind of like this whole process of checking for the connection to not mangle with the actual bit of my function that's doing my work, the stuff I care about in here. I mean, look how small this is without all that logic. And so that's when I'll start developing a utility function. Now there's a couple of things to look at here. First of all, I'm not using a commandlet style name in this thing. And I'm not using the more formal parameter block. What I'm going to do here is, let's say works is true. Now we're going to start with the ping. If test connection computer, because I still do have a parameter, I'm just accepting the parameter in kind of this shortcut fashion rather than spelling out an entire parameter block. So if test connection works, and I actually need to put a quiet on there because that's how you get a true false, I'm going to put an else in here so that if it doesn't work, I can set my works variable to false. And then in here I'll do a quick error trapped WMI connection. So error trapped means I'm going to put it in a try catch block. If the catch block executes, then that's when I set works to false because it failed. And what I'm going to try is GWMI, Win32 BIOS, computer, whatever's in the computer variable here, and then we'll set error action to stop. Now, I want to point out a couple of things I've done here. I'm using just kind of a cheap function name. It's not a real commandlet name. I'm not using the PowerShell standard verb noun syntax. I'm using this informal way of passing in the parameter instead of a formal param block. I'm not using commandlet binding. I'm not providing any comment-based help. I'm using aliases. I mean, I'm kind of breaking a lot of my own little best practices here. And at the end, I'm just going to return whatever's in that works variable. This is just a utility function. I don't want other human beings dealing with this. I've not really set it up. It's set up to be a shortcut for me, not set up to be something I'm proud of, to be honest. But it makes it easy for me to use it in these functions. So the ones I am proud of, if check computer, and I can just put all my functions code right in that if block. And so now all of this code doesn't clutter up the functions I am proud of. They're fairly straightforward. It also means it's much easier for me to go up to any other function in the same module and implement that. So pretty much right here, if, oops, did not mean to put caps lock on. If check computer, I can do this same thing and just kind of wrap all of my function up. And now I have to indent everything. Oops, not that one. There we go. I can just kind of utilize this in every single one of my functions without having to really clutter them up much. So let's collapse these two function definitions and focus on this. So let's say I save that. Now I'm going to import the module over here. Import module example. Okay. Now I can run check localhost. Yeah, but man, it's returning the thing. All right, so you know what? I actually want to out that to null. This is one reason I liked moving this logic into a separate function. I realized that it's outputting the WMI it got if it worked. Well, now I need to fix that. I wanted to suppress that. I was really just looking to see if it worked. I didn't care about the output. Well, having this all in one place means I can go make the change in one place. So let's remove the module and import it again. I'll do that on one line by separating the two commands with a semicolon. And we'll try check localhost again. Okay, it output true. Now let's try check not online. This is going to take a second because it's going to have to time out on that ping first. I don't know if I've mentioned this in a previous Nugget or not, but I did this once at a client, and there was a computer called not online on their network for some reason. So I did this, fully expecting it to come back false or fail. And in fact, it worked just fine and said true. And I had to kind of bang my head on the keyboard for about 5 minutes before I realized what was happening. Okay, false. That's good. Problem is, this is non-standard. You know, it's not, I've not meant for other people to see this. Like I said, I'm not proud of it. It's not using comment-based help. It's not using a really good function name, verb-noun name. It's just, I kind of wanted it hidden. I really only want it to be used by things that are inside this module. Here's how I can do that. Export module member. Function get disk space info, comma, set computer state. In a module, by default, every function or variable you define is visible to anyone who uses the module. At the end of your module, though, if you put export module member, and you can do something similar in the module manifest if you want to do it that way. Once you start naming the things you want exported, then those are the only things visible. So let's make sure I saved that. Good. And we'll remove and re-import. Check localhost. I don't know what you're talking about. There is no commandlet name check, because now it's hidden. It's private to this module. Anything in this module will still be able to use check. So I should still be able to do get disk space info, computer name, localhost. It worked. There was no error saying check wasn't recognized because get disk space info is able to see it because it lives in the same function. But check has not been exported from the function. In other words, it hasn't been made public. So I've kind of hidden it, and now it is a private utility function. Now there's something else really cool I can do with export module member. Up here at the very top of my module, my script, I'm going to create a new variable called example drive type preference, and I'm going to set it to local. Now if you remember, here in my get disk space info function, I have a parameter drive type that defaults to local. So if you run this function and you don't specify the drive type parameter, it'll be local. You could give it the value floppy or optical instead. Check this out. I'm going to replace that with that variable. Now because this variable is defined in the script, it's visible inside of the functions that are also in this script. That's how scoping works in PowerShell. We covered that several nuggets back. I've not changed the functionality here. Instead of setting this to local, I've set it to this variable, but that variable is set to local. All right, let's collapse these. I'm going to make sure that variable gets exported. Common mistake is to do this. That won't work. The variable name does not include the $sign. I'm not telling it to export the contents of the variable. I'm telling it that I want this variable, this container, to be visible outside the module. Watch what this does. We're going to remove and re-import the module. And now I'm going to look at my variable drive. And these are alphabetical. And I have example drive type preference. And it's set to local. Look. Remove module example. Dir variable. Now that I removed the module, example drive type preference is gone. So by having this defined in the module and exported from the module, it's able to clean up after itself once I remove the module, so that the variable comes and goes with the module. So let's import the module again, because I want to show you what I'm going to do with this. Import module example. So that means I should have example drive type preference. It tab completes. It's set to local. Get disk space info minus computer name localhost, and it should just get my local drive. And it did. Example drive type preference equals optical. Get disk space info again. Now it got my optical drive. You see, by changing this variable, and that's a sticky change, I've altered the default behavior of the commandlet. So if I was going to run this several times and I didn't want to keep having to type minus drive type optical, I could just change the preference. Now look, I can still override that by specifying the drive type parameter. So I'll switch it back to local. This works a lot like the preference variables that are built into PowerShell, things like verbose preference or error action preference. I've created a preference variable. That variable's contents become the default for this drive type parameter, and I can change that default simply by changing the contents of the variable. I can always override the preference by simply specifying the drive type parameter manually. I use this in a lot of modules, for example, where I'm doing error logging, and that's something that we'll come to in a couple of modules. I'll show you how I use these preference variables that way. But the neat thing is, when I remove the module, see, I'm tab completing, but I'm not getting it. When I remove the module, the variable goes away, meaning PowerShell is able to clean up the shell environment and remove everything that the module brought in. So this is a really neat set of approaches, both building private utility functions that are only visible within the module itself, and the way you make them private is to export everything you want public. As soon as you start exporting things, everything becomes private by default, and only the things you export become public. And you can also use that trick to make a variable public. Now I could have plenty of variables internally here. I'm not going to export that though. So when I import the module example and I look for the variable internal, it's not there. But example drive type preference is, because internal didn't get exported. So internal could be a way for my functions inside this module to share information with one another. and I'm still protecting that from being seen or modified by a user of this module. So it's a really neat set of approaches that let you control the interface of your module while having things exist in the module that you don't really want people to use. It's not that they can't see it. They could always open up the module and look. But as a user of the module, they're going to be restricted from using it. Now, that means, for example, I don't have to put a lot of validation or checking on computer because it's not going to be used by the public. My validation and checking occurs in the functions that the public is actually going to be using. It's a really neat set of approaches. So now you know how to use export module member to make public specific functions within your module, which has the effect of making everything else private. And I've also shown you how to use that technique to make a private variable or a public variable. And when I make those public variables, I tend to make them as kind of a preference variable. They're often used to set the default for parameters that are used by functions within that module. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.